One mistake can change everything, as does how you go about amending it. Cliché line to be sure, but one that stands as the crux of what the Arcueid route is. For instance, it's one little mistake done out of a whim, out of an inherent urge he feels, that leads Shiki to meeting Arcueid. While this event and how you answer it is the one that kicks off the near side routes, more than that, it's why Arcueid becomes attracted to Shiki. Not to say she's in love with the idea of being chopped into 17 pieces of meat, but when Shiki tells her that she was his first kill, she finds a commonality on which she can relate to. To jump way forward, but at the same time back, Arcueid made an eerily similar life-altering bump in the road. The details are a bit unclear, but suffice to say, she gave into an inherent urge and drank Roa's blood. For the next 800 years, she cut off all other emotion in an attempt to right that wrong. She simply can't forgive herself for it and sees it as her sole purpose. While the circumstances are a bit different, the realization that Shiki had a similar "what have I done" moment after giving into an invasive impulse makes her realize he's going down the same path. So laser focused on making amends that life becomes meaningless. After seeing a little of what his world offers, she doesn't want him to do that. She forgives him almost immediately for things she still hasn't forgiven herself for. And she can't do that until reaching a sense of closure, a sense of acceptance. And therein lies the other major part of the route. I brought up in the Yumizuka video that sweet Satsuki needed a mentor figure in her life like Shiki had in his sensei. While not exactly along the same lines, once the events of the route start kicking into gear, Shiki and Arc fulfill that role for one another more or less. Both are tossed into a world of confusion upon their second meeting. Sitting on the railing, waiting for the poor soul who attacked her to fulfill his daily routine, Arcueid does some thinking. A sense of obligation to hunt drove her for an ungodly amount of time, yet this one schoolboy strolls along and kills her. A rush of anger naturally bubbles up to the surface. Ironically, it's that state of being less than happy, which makes her happy. It's hard to recognize with the way she outwardly acts, but Arcueid is typically one apathetic vampire. Apathy is something nearly everyone deals with at some point in their life. A lack of emotions, going through the motions, and moving from one cycle to the next in a mind-numbing spiral that's descent is only viewable from the outside looking in. Arcueid is like we see Shiki halfway through the route after she and him part for the first time. Going through the day, holding on to the distant mirage of what may or may not ever happen. That spiral of being unaware of the outside world, only taking an active role solely when it makes ends meet, is something she can only see once Shiki kills her. While she certainly does need protection after being weakened by him, knowing more about the mere mortal who could do such a thing to her is clearly a higher priority. Just what could he be like? Thoughts filling her head one by one to the point she can't be angry at him. She's still alive, and if Shiki is willing to protect her, she gets to learn more about him in the meantime. It's a win-win, and though it's fronted with the pretense of needing a bodyguard, in the 800 years of looking towards a horizon without Roa clouding the sky, this is presumably the first time she's done anything extra. She has so much fun just talking to Shiki that she eventually comes to the question of, is this right? Partaking in the human world when she knows full well how it could turn out, getting close to someone when it could end in tragedy, and actively abstaining from her goal. She's having fun, clearly, but that always nags at the back of her mind, as well as a permeating sense of guilt that she dragged Shiki into this. All the affirmations in the world still can't change the fact that she really didn't give him a choice in all of this. Arcueid is typically a carefree and happy-seeming individual, but underlying all that is an ever-present feeling that she's making another mistake. A mistake that provides her more joy than absolutely anything, to be sure, but doing extra things flies in the face of what Arcueid Brunstad was created for. Now stop me if you've heard this one before. Arcueid's nature is that of a vampire that hunts other vampires. Still a vampire, or true ancestor with a growing thirst, at heart, but one that is steadfast in her commitment to accomplish that goal. Both when true ancestors were a prevalent thing, or at least more than one, and now that her sole focus is Roa, that's been the status quo from day one. 'Tis a focus that, once removed from being her sole passion in life, makes her rethink why it was so vital in the first place. It's not something she can just abandon, but now that she sees that there's more to life than wake, hunt, sleep, she stands on the precipice of the two sides. Does she keep barreling down the path of least resistance, or does she let in extra things and find some new meaning that isn't a dead end? It's clear what should be the right choice, but to be the one actually making that choice is a whole other story. How hard is it to just abandon a lifestyle you've lived for years, in her case, centuries? The better choice may be obvious to you or me, but like an addiction, there's a creeping sense that if she doesn't keep living that way, then something is fundamentally wrong with her. So, in the meantime, she interacts with Shiki in an attempt to connect the missing fragments of her personality together. The way they met was less than unconventional, but he is her gateway to a world where doing unnecessary things is viewed as the norm. Sure, everyone may not be as jubilant as her, but to someone who spent a perpetual eternity lost in a spiral of obligation, simple things like talking and eating fast food are akin to the first time you watch an anime or read a good visual novel. It's a gateway to a world of untapped potential. It's not off the mark to say she's like a newborn at times with the amount of enjoyment she gets from simple things like watching a film. Seeing things like that inspires Shiki, and thereby the reader, to go from being standoffish at her second appearance, to appreciating her, to loving her. Shiki in this route, and the nearside routes in general honestly, is an inverse of Arcueid. Not to say the two are completely different, in both character arcs and motivations they share some striking similarities, but in terms of worldview they couldn't contrast more. From the outset, Shiki clearly has things he wants to accomplish, but he's more reactive than proactive in that regard. Him going to the mansion, meeting his sensei, and hell, all the way back to being adopted by the Tono, are all things he had no say in. He gets headstrong about things in the moment, hence why he was so adamant about playing with Akia as a child, but for the most part, Shiki is living his life in a rather leisurely manner. Whereas Arcueid blindly focuses on one thing, Shiki doesn't have much focus on anything. He goes by a stream of consciousness, and unless he's trying to protect his loved ones, he typically takes things as they come. Arcueid, by comparison, has a selfish motivation for taking down Roa, and is adamant about it to a fault. As the route goes on, the two counterbalance each other perfectly. Just as Arc used Shiki as a lens to view the outside world and do extra things, Shiki uses Arcueid in a similar manner to get more drive and focus in his life. The two start on polar opposite ends, and while both sides of the equation have positives and negatives, it's accepting both sides, not letting one overtake the other, that leads to them becoming more fulfilled people. People who can take accountability for their actions, as opposed to just bolting to the simplest conclusion. While I've discussed the Nanaya aspects at length in my past two videos on Tsuki, as it's been a little bit, and they are at peak levels in the nearside routes, it's a side Shiki can't really control. His very essence is to kill demons, Arcueid being the biggest example of that. When he sees her, all other thoughts are tantamount to shouting at the void. The sudden shift in emotions is something I cannot properly give Nasu credit for. The scene hits out of left field in the most paralyzing of ways. Even on a reread, I was taken with the language used throughout, and in the manga, the facial expressions Shiki makes are downright horrifying. His thought process being hijacked by those impulses is something to put a pin in for this route in particular, as it comes up in full force many times throughout, one of which I will talk about at length. As this was his first time dabbling in the art of using fine cutlery, however, needless to say, he's mortified by the actions he just took. Taking everything into account, the very next choice causes the near-side route split, mostly. Does Shiki accept the actions as his own, or write them off as some sick dream and avoid facing the facts? I love this choice. It's likely one Arcueid had to make years ago after partaking in the one sin of the true ancestors. As the latter choice of avoiding accountability is what leads to the Arcueid route, I like to think she made a similar one back then, only to be faced with the facts later and desperately attempting to hide the shame she feels in creating a dead apostle. Likewise, when Shiki next meets Arcueid and realizes it wasn't a dream, the emotions he would have gotten out in his talk with CL that are still pent up explode. The guilt, shame, and disgust at himself, and the realization that he deserves to die for what he did to her, makes him run away. Any impulse that could have taken over is meaningless in the face of the sheer terror he feels at seeing her. Once again, Shiki avoids accountability. Facing your life's biggest mistake head-on, tinged with the fear of death, is something no one wants to experience, let alone Shiki. I find it interesting that I was rooting for Shiki to get away at this moment, in spite of this being recompense for his earlier actions. Even with the earlier homicidal impulses taking over, what could he do against a monster who gets up from that? When the two finally do start to talk, things don't exactly go as expected. Shiki is taken back by her cheery demeanor and proposition. Arcueid, on the other hand, is just happy to have someone to talk to. That jovial look of hers only adds to Shiki's terror. In that alleyway, it's all he can do not to run away on a path that doesn't exist. The front Shiki gave himself of, "this is all a dream," is a lie so bad it doesn't even fool him. But it's something he had to tell himself to keep his sanity. In the inverse option, Shiki can't move on until CL comes around and gives him an outlet for all those emotions. In this route, however, he's in the same position Arcueid was once, giving in to an impulse they both thought they didn't have, terrified of themselves and everyone around them, and once confronted with the reality of the situation, everything else is ancillary. Arcueid sees aspects of herself reflected in Shiki as she gets to know more about him. Their relationship, formed out of necessity, quickly turns into one of, well, a relationship. She seems far more interested in talking than actually accomplishing anything. In what I feel is a detriment to the story, Shiki and Arcueid only talk about lore-related elements. Everything else is just glossed over for us to discover more about later. Even if just leading into a conversation that trailed off, giving the readers a hint early on that Arcueid is unfamiliar with the world Shiki inhabits during their conversation, as opposed to bringing it up only when relevant, would have planted seeds early on for their date scene to capitalize on. As they say though, hindsight is 20/20. And to its credit, their talk here does establish that Arcueid is fascinated with even the concept of conversation. While Arcueid is indulging in extra things, Shiki, seeing that her cheery act isn't actually an act, is going from a state of immeasurable stress to falling back to his normal demeanor. He's the type to slowly adapt to any situation he finds himself in, even social ones. Unless, once again, something fundamentally eats at his mind. For instance, in the brief glimmers of the Yumizuka route we got, he can get so down to the point of avoiding CL and Arihiko at school due to his worry about her. When it's a mindset that overpowers those Nanaya instincts, Shiki fundamentally changes into something reminiscent of what we hear about in his childhood. Someone willing to go the extra mile to protect those he holds dear and those he's wronged. The nauseating amount of fear and nerves being supplanted by Ark's carefree attitude put his mind at ease when he learns that he can actually trust this girl. As a matter of fact, the same day, Shiki says she's too trusting. Now, I shouldn't have to explain why sleeping around your supposed bodyguard, who you think is a crazed killer at this point, is a bad idea. But this plays into one of the big factors in Arcueid's nature that, as I'll cover more in depth next time, contrast perfectly with CL's. Regardless of how jokey her tone may come off, it's 100% genuine. While Arcueid finds the outside world fascinating, she's also not barred down by the standard conventions of it. In spite of her maybe or maybe not being tricked by Roa in the past, again, the details are muddled, she can see that Shiki will stick to his word just by looking at him. He's right when he says that she's stupidly naive, but that's every bit a compliment as it is an insult. A slight side note. Shiki is a tsundere in this route. This is a point he flat out admits. He's only mean to people who he likes and trusts. Arihiko and Arcueid stand out in particular, as how he interacts with both is so scarily similar that I'm convinced that some fan out there has written some fairly seamless yaoi fanfiction. To Shiki, Arihiko is someone he holds no reservations around, and Arcueid swiftly starts to fill that same void as Shiki sets the record for truancy. Their conversation, though we don't see much of it, takes on that tone whenever Arcueid isn't lore expositing about vampires and her goal. Mixing that 6 hours of off-screen conversation never brought up again but vital to Shiki's growing affection for Arcueid, in with the way Shiki is about protecting people, and even the choice to leave, leads right back to her doorstep. Shiki is able to so easily call her out on her naivety because it's something intrinsically a part of him. Again, the two have lived vastly different lives, yet ended up the same mentally when things come down to the wire. Much as Tsukihime is a story of nature versus nurture with a clear bias towards nurture, it's just as important what kind of nature is at the center of a person. Both Shiki and Arcueid have essentially two different natures to them. To ask them to abandon the entire concept and solely rely on nurture is something that'd be dead on arrival. No one can fundamentally change on that level, but what they can do is decide which one of those natures to support. This is going to be an extremely oversimplified version, but if we take the concept of Yin and Yang and separate it into Nanaya Shiki and Tono Shiki, it should start to make some more sense. There's positive and negative sides to both of them, and it's clear to anyone that Tono Shiki is the more sane individual. But there's always going to be that little bit of Nanaya in him, ready to take over and invert at any second, flipping the script and making Shiki the little voice. And that inversion is something that will continue to happen throughout the route, Shiki being afraid of himself, trying to block out that little dot of black in the yang that is Tono Shiki. Isolating it and trying to abandon it only lasts for as long as he has the mental fortitude, and that's something he can't keep up. In the near side routes, Nanaya Shiki simply comes out far more often. Arcueid tells him early on that use of his eyes will erode at his mind, and while we never see any Emiya Shiro levels of mind pollution, those impulses of his come out bit by bit, each time taking hold more. The Nero Chaos fight is where we start to see that little bit of yin mix into the yang to form a gray mishmash of Nanaya and Shiki. The thought process spanning simply the words kill takes root, but it's spurred on by a compulsion to save Arcueid. He saw the carnage this thing induced, and that in tandem with his beloved being moments away from death, and, well, things don't go so well for old Nero Chaos. While he gives into the Nanaya side a bit too much in this fight, the moment he sees Arcueid, he can switch it off in an instant. To equate Nanaya Shiki to anything, it'd be most apt to say to Shiki proper, he's like a sickness. While he can't cut it out, there are ways to alleviate it. During this fight, for instance, he accepted that side of himself, if only for a moment, and accomplished something wonderful. I've said before that Nanaya Shiki isn't all bad, but as we see time and time again, he is still mostly bad. The two sides can exist simultaneously, but just as a vampire eventually gives in to the impulse to drink blood at some point in their existence, Nanaya is always one misstep from slithering out into the night. Speaking of vampires, Arcueid finds herself going down a very similar arc in this route. As a matter of fact, the urge to drink blood seems to be equal in impact to the urges Shiki has, at least to Arcueid. Slight side note before I continue. The discussion of sexual assault and how it pertains to this route is going to be talked about a decent amount going forward. If the discussion of such topics affect you in any way, and I want to preface there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. Here's a time code for after this part ends. I touched on it a bit in the Satsuki video with the urges she felt being a parallel to Shiki's, but to make an overt comparison, the urge to drink blood by Arcueid seems to be equal to the sexual urges Shiki has in this route. The two are directly compared in the choices the reader is given, and in the actions of Arcueid and Shiki. At this point in the route, a few days after the Nero fight, Arcueid is low on energy, emotions, and most importantly, restraint. In the heat of the moment after their date, she jokes about drinking Shiki's blood to see if she's really a vampire. Rather it be a whim of hers, or simply her testing herself to see if she can hold back around someone she's grown to love, it causes her to run away in an attempt to compose herself. Coming face to face with her one search later, the sight Shiki sees is bone-chilling. We've been in the mind of a murderous monster various times throughout the route. This, however, is the first time we see just how terrifying a monster can be on the outside. Shiki is first mortified, but then, in a weakened mental state, that little speck of Nanaya telling him that such a thing shouldn't exist doesn't seem so crazy anymore. Those aspects worked in tandem with Shiki to stop Nero in a positive way, But here, those intrusive thoughts play off Shiki's attraction to satisfy those sickly impulses. Combined with this is Arcueid's mystic eyes and his own eyes eroding away at any restraint he once had. Seeing Arcueid's reaction to his actions causes a brief bit of sanity to return. From here, Shiki can either continue unabashedly or give pause for how Arcueid is feeling, and realize, as cliche as this sounds, that his love for her means more than appealing to his Nanaya side. Choices in Tsukihime are typically minor changes or lead to instant death. This one, however, is different. If the choice to continue with the assault is chosen, then the route continues for a day. On that day, all Shiki does is regret his actions. Every line of dialogue is solely for him hating himself. The wave of regret felt by both Shiki and the reader by association is crushing. They made the choice without regard to Arcueid and gave in to sick curiosity. To bring it back around, after they meet once more, Arcueid does not hold back about drinking Shiki's blood like she did before. How could she hold back when he didn't? Both Shiki and Arcueid give in to their base desires, leading to what I believe is the longest bad end in the game. A bad end that in its structure and length beats in the point that giving pause and taking what the other feels into account is sorely needed for them to grow past the impulses tying them down. Now, could this scene have been done differently without the sexual assault? Technically, sure. It could have been another instance of Shiki trying to kill Arcueid or something along those lines. But here's a counterpoint. It shows us how disgusted Arcueid is for herself over drinking Roa's blood. It's something she had no control over, yet still haunts her. Shiki's moping about, questioning if he's even worthy of being alive, yet still holding on to the faint hope of making things right is, as with so many other points in the story, a reflection of Arcueid's own experiences. To state the obvious, rape is a horrible thing. In modern society, it's one of, if not the most egregious sin one can commit. What we're told about true ancestors is that they're pure beings, better than humans in every way save one. Drinking blood is viewed as the single worst thing one of them can do. Arcueid was accredited to not even have that impulse when she was younger. At that time, her prerogative was solely to hunt true ancestors who had fallen down that slippery slope. Hell, it's posited in the manga that that itself is what attracted Roa to Arcueid in the first place. The air about her that she was truly the one pure life in existence. The expectations put in place for her as this perfect lunar princess without a single flaw, juxtaposed with the indelible sin of drinking blood, be it her being deceived into it or not, is something that throws everything she thought about herself out of the window. She wasn't this perfect specimen. She was something to be feared and hunted down by the church just like the rest of the vampires. Worst of all, she gave birth to a monster that would always remind her of that fact. If the rape scene had been replaced with another act of trying to kill Arcueid, would that have been nearly as impactful? No, it's something we've already seen before at the beginning of the route. To repeat that not only would feel repetitive, but would take away the shock value and disgust the reader's supposed to feel after the scene. Taking that away devalues how mortified Arcueid is with herself that she almost drank blood again. We see how Shiki feels after the scene, and that's something Arcueid's been feeling for the better part of 8 centuries. More importantly, this wasn't something done when she was unaware of the impulse. It was a situation she put herself into. A situation she put Shiki into. To drive the point home, this is essentially like beating the one you hold most dear with a baseball bat, all the while laughing hysterically while you scream inside at yourself, begging to whatever force possessed you to stop. But the brakes, they've long been severed. The abhorrent nature of the scene, the dry, uncomfortable writing, lack of music, just Shiki losing to those Nanaya impulses and giving in to sickening desire. is everything Arcueid feels when she puts her lips on his neck. It's an irreplaceable bit of symmetry that fits the narrative like a glove. Nothing is glorified or played up for sales numbers, it's just a genuinely ugly scene. And through it, the reader is shown how Arcueid's urges affect her as opposed to being told. My main bit of criticism levied toward the near-side routes of Tsukihime is the rule of show, don't tell. While I think the lore dumps provided by Arcueid and Ciel are certainly vital elements, it's always far more cathartic for Shiki or the reader to come to the conclusion on their own. Tsukihime flounders a bit on that mark, however. While the aforementioned scene is an excellent example in showing the reader Arcueid's feelings about drinking blood, rather than her just saying it's akin to sexual lust, her history, and just Roa in general, is handled so piss poorly that it's kinda sad. We never truly get a sense of what Roa is capable of, why he's set up at the school, and just what his modus operandi is. While I'd like to give Tsuki credit for exploring those elements in other routes, as Roa and Arc have the biggest connection to one another, it's just a shame that those elements have been sidelined. What I brought up before with Arcueid rampaging on some of the dead in the alleyway is pretty much the most Roa gets threat-wise. 1 or 2 dead pop up, and while Shiki is hesitant to kill them at first, even that's a thread that's swiftly sidelined as quickly as it appears. Nero, the more or less mid-boss, had a wonderful build-up, letting us see exactly what he's capable of, the limits of Shiki's mystic eyes, the relation Arcueid has with the dead apostles, and the fight itself feels legitimately tense. Shiki being surrounded by animals, being picked apart bit by bit is something described so well that a CG isn't needed to illustrate the sheer pain. Taking into account Arcueid being subdued, and the carnage at the hotel, and even if Shiki reverts back to the sadistic tendencies of his Nanaya self, the audience is still rooting for him. Rooting for the same aspect of Shiki that has and will do horrible things to Arcueid, because we want that threat gone and for everyone to be safe. It's odd then that Roa literally just throws out a few dead that are effortlessly dispatched, rarely going out of his base for anything save satisfying Tono twice. Roa just doesn't have any presence in the story where he should be the most present. Roa is the one who ruined Arcueid's life, who might have caused her to kill all the other true ancestors and single-mindedly focus on one unattainable goal. But we're told all that by Ciel and then Arcueid at the end of the route. It's infinitely frustrating, and though I realize the manga solves this issue in spades, when I read the visual novel, Roa's lack of presence sticks out like a sore thumb. Everything about him is sidelined for progressing the character arcs of Arcueid and Shiki, while not taking into account that the presence Roa is built up to have would play into them overcoming their own issues to combat him perfectly. Not to say the nearly explicit focus on Arcueid and Shiki's relationship isn't a good thing, though. While I wish Roa was fleshed out more, Arcueid and Shiki's relationship is, simply put, beautiful. The two are like a mirror with one on each side. They're opposites, yet a reflection of the same mentality and ideal. Now, while I'm a sucker for the romance presented in the Akia route, even I have to admit, of all the relationships in Tsukihime, this one feels the most natural. The route spends most of its time between the two just talking and enjoying one another's company. Once the first night in the hotel is over, though it was a hellish night, you can tell the two in such a short time grew to care about one another beyond that initial obligation. Arcueid patching herself up with packing tape, leading to Shiki swiftly berating her and rushing out to get medical supplies, is immediately indicative of the dynamic these two so wonderfully exude. They're unaware of the lives the other have led, unaware of the customs and methodology, or anything that the other takes for granted. Shiki treats Arcueid's wounds with the same methods he grew up learning, and though he is a protective creature at heart, he gets a certain satisfaction at seeing her feel even slightly better and smiling again. When Shiki gets heavily injured after the Nero fight, Arcueid treats him with the methods that she grew up learning. It's shown early on that this relationship, though bordering on codependency at times, isn't a one-way street. Even at their weakest points, they learn to rely on one another. Being put into a life-or-death scenario during those times means they not only grow their affection at a rapid rate, but their trust. Trust is so heavily instilled that when Shiki can't make it to their usual meetup, Arcueid crawls into his room and looks over him until he wakes up. Now, to a general person, this behavior would be deemed as creepy or psychopathic, but Arcueid, unaware of social norms as she is, was just worried about him. He's someone she's come to rely on, and while that level of dependence is something that is clearly a detriment, at this point in the story, you can't really fault her for it. She needs him both as a protective force and as a guide of sorts through the new cacophony of feelings being stirred up within her. And Shiki echoes the same sentiment. When not around her, he's shown listlessly thinking about what she's doing, worrying about her, wondering about the next time they'll meet. It's honestly kinda cute seeing how much he actively looks forward to seeing her again. In spite of how scary Shiki can come across in scenes where he's lost himself, it's stuff like this that really makes him endearing as a protagonist. They find one another infinitely fascinating, and while I can't vouch for everyone who's read Tsukihime, I know I shared the same fascination in their dynamic. A dynamic so fun that the mere act of watching Arcueid eat fast food and scarf down a hamburger just to spite Shiki becomes one of the most fun scenes to read in the VN. It's an example of the meaningless conversations the audience has heard oh so much about. And to see the sheer absurdity of Arcueid looking around, wondering if she's doing this or that correctly, is something I could legitimately read for hours on end. When the two go on their date at Arcueid's request, it's more than an excuse to do cutesy things. Up till that point, Arc and Shiki had largely been living in the parameters of the world Arcueid inhabits, patrolling the streets, hunting vampires and the dead, and other such activities. Her proposition about spending the day with Shiki is essentially her wanting to dive into the inverse of that, into Shiki's easygoing world filled to the brim with what she views as the unnecessary. What follows is the culmination of what the route had been teasing for so long. While I can't overstate enough that it's a shame we skip most of what they talk about save for the lore and plot relevant stuff, the fragments of what we did see of meaningless conversation are in full force here. At the risk of repeating my Ilya analysis, to someone who spent most of her life alone, those conversations are not only the most interesting, but one of the most important things for her to grow outside of the bubble she's maintained for the better part of a millennia. At the end of the day, when they're sitting in the school with the red sunset flooding in through the windows, a set piece Nasu can't seem to get enough of, Arcueid asks the question I alluded to a while back. Is doing extra things okay? This date between Arcueid and Shiki is a bit of a test for her. Shiki's life, and by extension, world, is full of things she's fascinated by. But in the back of her mind was that one question she didn't want to answer out of fear of regretting either outcome. Either doing extra things is okay and her goal gets devalued, or they're not okay and what she's been doing with Shiki is unforgivable. Shiki's reply, though it's the most simple thing in the world, is one of the things I can't help but give Nasu credit for as a writer. Sure, the things he does may be meaningless, but Shiki gives them meaning. Arcueid's mind, which had been programmed in such a way that doing anything save for killing Roa was viewed as worthless, is fundamentally changed by that one answer. By giving those things, and by extension her relationship with Shiki, meaning by recontextualizing how she perceives things, she breaks out of her spiral. She finds a new meaning for things beyond herself, and when face to face with Roa, fights to protect Shiki instead of washing her hands of that sin. Shiki may have given her a detour at the beginning of the route, but with that one statement and a promise to meet up here again, he set her on a completely different path. He nudged her in the right direction, much as she does to him. While the two had an almost toxic level of codependency in the middle of the route, after the day of the date and the hellish impulses from both sides that followed after, Shiki heads to the park to keep his promise. During which he comes to the realization that, while he may have been swayed by her mystic eyes, those were little more than a go-ahead for his pent-up feelings mixing in with those Nanaya-tinged thoughts. He's actively denied thoughts of affection throughout the route. But when face to face with her again and thinking about everything that's led up to this point, he stops running from it and finally confesses. Whereas Arcueid accepted the happiness she felt the day prior, here Shiki accepts his own feelings. While I kinda wish the scene ended with the kiss, as that was all that was needed to convey the two finally accepting one another, From a thematic level, this H scene is one that sort of works. Not as much as the Akiya one, but it's still something done out of love and confirming the other's feelings. Feelings that, while having grown stronger than ever, no longer blind the two. Acceptance of one's own emotions is a surprisingly hard thing to do, but now that both sides have requited one another, there's nothing that will stop them from trying to do right by the other. Shiki wants to protect Arcueid, but as they are one and the same in that regard, Arcueid also wants to do the same to him. The next morning, when she's missing, Shiki feels betrayed, but he does understand it. One fruitless day of searching later, being stabbed by Roa, and becoming more or less bedridden, he takes a similarly rash action to try and save Arcueid from herself. He gives CL a less than intriguing proposition that, while bordering on overly edgy, is the kind of haphazard thing he'd say in an attempt to get help. CL on this route is an interesting little character. The VN is clearly trying to save all of her relevant plot points for her route, but without them she barely does more than Ilya in the second Heaven'sfeel movie. And that's not something I say lightly. For as much as I do love CL's route, in Arcueid's she has the Roa syndrome of just kind of being there. A plot device to exposit Lord Ashiki and then get him to the school, and not much else until her own route. I get the choice given the narrative, but it's still a shame that she became the victim of sharing half a route. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What lies in this scene is a rather compelling declaration of love by Shiki, something that convinces CL to help him, and an eavesdropping Arcueid further resolve to protect that notion. A detail I want to bring up is this panel from the manga. It's beautiful in conveying how Arcueid feels after hearing all of that. In keeping with the trend, again, this is something only talked about in the visual novel. When the lovers finally do meet, Arcueid is doing fairly rough. While the events that follow are most certainly cliché, I love every second. In her seemingly last action, she and Shiki kiss. While it has been done before, this one is different from that passion-filled act. No, this is a kiss that serves as a farewell and an arbiter of all her feelings towards Shiki. Gently, those two worlds meet, and as swiftly as they connected, part ways. Arcueid's struggle with going against her single-minded nature comes to an end with that kiss, and she accepts her need to indulge in meaningless things. Even if she can't do those things afterwards, it'll be something she'll dream of for centuries to come. The brief few days where she was at her weakest, both physically and emotionally, but how that led to her being her strongest. Shiki, on the other hand, goes into the night, for lack of a better term. He and his Nanaya side become one. The memory of him looking down at the figure of a bloody child as he sits above him covered in blood is one that haunts him throughout the route. It's something that, when combined with the initial meeting with Arcueid, makes him feel like he really is a senseless killer. That dream pops up more and more frequently as Roa makes appearances. When he appears outside of the mansion to sate the will of the body he's possessed, Shiki has the dream. When he's assaulted after school by Roa, Shiki has the dream. This serves to make the reader associate, even if subconsciously, a link between Shiki's childhood and Roa. While I personally feel like leaving it all to an exposition dump by Akiya is an incredibly lazy thing to do, I feel more lenient as it's something better explored in the Farside routes. Regardless, the childhood dynamic of Akiya, Shiki, and Tono is explained. The three played together as kids, and in particular Shiki and Tono apparently got along exceedingly well. To step a bit into Kagetsu Toya again, its 100% completion bonus is a scene called Drinking Dreaming Moon. While I have no intention of spoiling it, as it's something that is done a disservice by even calling it beautiful, I bring it up because it explores that dynamic between the two far more, and serves as payoff for Shiki's memory of Tono's near death when he comes back erratic at Shiki for stealing everything from him. While hammering home the sentiment of Shiki's near death with Roa is an excellent point, more scenes where we hear about how Tono was before his inversion impulse would have gone so far in setting him up as a more compelling antagonist. If the reader feels that connection, then there's real weight to Roa and by extension Tono in the Farside routes to be more than a stopgap on the way to completing character arcs. Forgive me for sounding like a broken record, but again, this is something handled infinitely better in the manga, where Tono and, by extension, Roa get further characterization. However, he does serve his role of completing character arcs admirably. The realization that he wasn't the killer in his dream, and that what happened with Arcueid was a result of his actual heritage, drives the point home for Shiki that he isn't like he thought. And while he never flat out says it, if he can control that nature like Arcueid controls her vampiric urges, then there's no reason they can't be together. When Arcueid has seemingly died, something clicks in that head of his. His mind never goes into that homicidal state, but he sees Roa as nothing but a target. He analyzes the situation to take him down in the most efficient strategy. Throughout the route, these points of death have been talked about non-stop at the mere mention of the mystic eyes of death perception. As Shiki abuses his eyes, sure they erode his mind, but they also get stronger. This started with seeing the points on the living things, and now inanimate things. Roa, for as much as he's talked about, is dealt with so effortlessly by Shiki stabbing the point of death within the school, and then Roa's point, that I'm honestly conflicted on it. For one, this is the nail in the coffin for Roa's character having little to nothing to do with the plot outside of being bad for the sake of eternal life. He's like Zoken without the manipulation, like Nero without the animals and drive to hunt Arcueid. In the most bare-bones sense of the word, Roa is a boring character propped up by things that are so goddamn interesting that seeing nothing be done with them drives me up a wall. Conversely, this is the culmination of Shiki's character arc, who's learned to have a drive beyond when it's necessary and accepts his place as a mislabeled member of the Tono household and his own Nanaya nature without it overpowering him. As the two sides, Shiki and Nanaya, are now one, fighting to erase a monster for the sake of who he loves, while at the same time not indulging in it like in the Nero fight, it's only natural that it'd be over in an instant. The only way I can think of to remedy this is to show more of Roa and Arcueid's fight, showing her fighting for who she loves rather than just what Shiki sees. Had Tsukihime been written 4 years later and Nasu had the idea of interludes in his head, I feel like so much of this, Roa's backstory, his motives, how he interacts with everyone he's wronged, and just everything about him, Arcueid, and CL could have been done so much better. It's the only glaring flaw on a story I absolutely love. But, as with all things you love in life, you have to learn to accept the flaws inherent to it and learn to let it go. As it's a fleeting thing that if you try to keep to yourself will burn you in a pit of your own shame and desire. I've alluded to it, but about halfway through the route, Shiki is left alone. It's after the Nero fight, and Arcueid and him have seemingly parted for good. He can't shake that lingering affection and doesn't even try. He wants to indulge in those feelings of self-pity and longing, as it's the only thing tying him to his first love. Seeing Shiki at this point makes me feel disgusted. Not at Shiki, mind you, but at myself for harboring the same feelings towards my first love once upon a time. It's those feelings that you try so hard to let go of, but like a drug always come back because you just can't let go. And so, again and again, I got burned by it, falling down a pit of my own self-desire because I sought of lack of closure in a relationship that was fated to never really have any. As most first relationships go, it was an awkward, depressing affair looking back, but holding on to those few moments of bliss as a crutch are what keeps someone coming back to that pit regardless of how bad it burns. Shiki at that point in the story is in the first stages of doing that, never letting go and letting it absorb his every thought until he finally does see her again. Even if it was through, as what Shiki perceives as her death, he gets a bit more closure than he had before. Those feelings aren't something that bind him, but something that he can look back on fondly, smile, and move on from. To go about this in a backwards way, the good ending, Moon at Dawn, is essentially a continuation of the true ending, after both have moved on from those toxic feelings of codependency into ones of mutual affection that serves to complement and not supplement the other. It's a happy ending that reunites the two after Arcueid regains her strength and plays so nicely into Kagetsu Toya that I can't help but love it. The two get to love one another and do the extra things they talked about so much. It's the payoff for their relationship, and seeing it continue is something that warms the heart. The reason I did this backwards is because the true ending of the route, titled Tsukihime, is, simply put, the ideal ending to me. The good ending provides all of those feel-good vibes, but the true ending ties into the themes of the route so much better. When it starts, Shiki is in an oddly familiar state. Like in the middle of the route, he's going about his day-to-day routine, and though he's shaken by the loss of Arcueid, he's reconciled those feelings a bit. It might have been a topsy-turvy few days, but it was an irreplaceable time for the both of them. Though he's saddened, his actions still move towards the next day, focusing on the now instead of on the what if. But, like all humans, there is that little voice in his head that wishes they would have fulfilled their promise to meet at sunset once more. So he habitually stays after school until long after the sun is set, staring longingly at the moon. This brief time for recollection is his way of moving on, to never break his promise to her again. While it's melancholic in tone, Shiki is in the beginning stages of acceptance. In this fragment of time, he thinks about the what-ifs. What if they met again? What if he could speak to her one last time? What if things turned out differently? In what could be considered a dream, she appears in the window. Though something's different about her. This time, Arcueid is playing the realist. Shiki's dreams of spending more time with her are something she desperately wants to requite, but she just can't. More than indulging in what would be fun for her, she's reached a point of acceptance, and she wants that for Shiki. He was in the beginning stages, but seeing him stay in the classroom day after day made it clear he was too stubborn to let go without months or years wasted. Shiki craves that ideal future where he and Arcueid can be together to the point of begging her to drink his blood. Shiki is being irrational, grasping onto little more than a pipe dream. It's reminiscent of a scene I've covered before in the Akia route where he clings to her out of his own pitifulness. The response this elicits from Arcueid is in the same vein as Akia's back then. Things simply can't be the way you wish for all the time. Arcueid learned that the hard way when she spent upwards of 800 years hunting Roa to no avail. If Shiki's mindset leads him from the classroom out into a search for her to chase those ideals, then he'd fall into the same trappings she did mentally, an immovable mindset that chases an ideal future to little or no avail. I both love and hate that Arcueid's history with Roa is placed here. It fails in the sense that it takes yet another interesting point that could have been built upon relating to Roa and gives it to us in another expository section. But it also really works in the sense that this is coming from Arcueid. She couldn't talk about this until now because it was her last bastion of holding on to that initial image of herself. She spent centuries trying to hide that mistake, and now that she lets it go to both Shiki and herself, the pair of lovers have seen everything about the other. Every last detail has been laid bare. No more loose ends, no more wondering about the future or past, and no more what-ifs. Arcueid is too far gone to be around Shiki without hurting him and those around him. And just as quickly as they met, the two part. Shiki spends the rest of the day in inconsolable mess. All his illusions have been dispelled and he's left to confront reality. A reality that was clearly far from the ideal one he imagined. While this ending seemingly leaves little to be desired when paired with a route filled to the brim with dark twists and turns, there is a hope in this route and this ending that really is inspiring. The blue glass moon under the crimson air, our listless lunar princess, if you will, always encourages both the reader and Shiki to press onward regardless of mixed thoughts or the dreaded question of what if. In her last act, she gives Shiki the will to accept things as they are, and they both finally reach the through line of the route. Acceptance. He looks up at the glass moon, which feels so close yet just barely out of reach, and says a long overdue farewell to the girl he grew to love more than his own life. Arcueid will always be dreaming of the time the two shared, and Shiki will use those memories as a catalyst to move forward instead of getting trapped in them. Of all the endings, there is a clear reason this one is titled Tsukihime. I'm a sucker for bittersweet endings, and this route ends so well that I smile even thinking about it. Going into this project, the Aki route was by far my favorite. But after being so conflicted with its ending and diving into the Arcueid route full stop, it's quickly been succeeded. Perfect by any means, God no. Tsukihime, especially in the near side routes, was clearly a rushed product, and as I continue this reread, that only becomes more and more readily apparent. However, the character writing, the relationship between Arcueid and Shiki, and how the two reconcile their own issues through each other is the kind of thing I live for. It's handled so well, and as I've alluded to throughout, is handled even better in the manga. The manga itself made me re-examine a lot about this route, making me look deeper into it until I had a script nearly the length of my Ilian Heavensfield video, a feat I never thought I'd achieve again. It is, by all means, the better version of the story, bar none. And just how it improves on the source material is a subject I've already written 30 pages about in the process of reading. God! To everyone who's waited a while for this to come out, I do sincerely apologize. With rereading the manga, route, note-taking, rewriting the script, and admittedly me getting distracted with a myriad of other things to alleviate writer's block, this project turned from getting done within the week to within the month. However, I came away from all this with a new appreciation for Tsukihime. Not just the Arcueid route, mind you. I've thought about how the Ciel, Kohaku, and Hisui routes play into the overall narrative, how they relate back to Shiki, and what they mean for the characters themselves. With that new framework in mind, I feel reinvigorated to dive back into the story full stop and finish what I've started as soon as possible. To not mince words, the Arcueid route was my least favorite route when I first read Tsukihime. While I haven't finished this reread, as of now, I can most certainly say that looking at it and analyzing it has made me grow to appreciate it more than any other route so far. Which has been one, but hey, progress. If I had to rank the routes by my own personal enjoyment, the Arcueid route would easily snag the top spot as of now. To all of the commenters who have responded to the last two videos, and in particular this commenter, whose name I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce, but had a wonderful talk about the route and who suggested I read the manga, thank you. I hope this, and what's to come in the near future, gives someone a new appreciation for this story. I know I've most certainly gotten one through rereading and my interactions with you all. Let's meet again somewhere in Tsukihime.